Hello, this is part 62, NSE4 Fortinet exam preparation. Let's talk about central NAT, network address translation. We can enable or disable central NAT on the graphical user interface or on command line interface. On graphical user interface, we go to System, followed by Settings, followed by Central NAT. And using command line interface, we can configure system settings, set central-NAT, enable, and by default, central NAT is disabled, so we can enable it via graphical user interface and command line interface. And after central NAT is enabled, the following two options are available to be configured on the graphical user interface: central SNAT, DNAT, and virtual IPs. What happens if we try to enable central NAT but there are still IP pools or VIPs configured in firewall policies? The command line interface does not allow this and presents a message referencing the firewall policy ID with the virtual IP address or IP pool. We must remove VIP, virtual IP, or IP pool references from existing firewall policies in order to enable central NAT. How do we remove VIPs and IP pools? We go on command line interface, type config system settings, set central NAT enable, and it gives message cannot enable NAT with firewall policy using VIP. So we remove those IP addresses, VIP and IP pools, if they are configured, and then we are able to set central-NAT enable. Once enabled, there are following options on GUI: central SNAT, source NAT, and DNAT and virtual IPs. Central SNAT is mandatory for the new next generation firewall policy based mode. This means that SNAT, source NAT, behaves only according to the NAT settings found by clicking on graphical user interface, policy and objects, then central NAT. When we enable central NAT, we configure SNAT on the central NAT page on the FortiGate graphical user interface. It is useful for advanced SNAT, firewall policy, and central SNAT policy segregation. It simplifies firewall policy configuration. The main benefit of using central NAT for SNAT is firewall policy and central SNAT policy segregation. This is particularly useful for advanced SNAT configuration comprising of multiple networks and IP pools. Instead of enabling NAT and selecting IP pools on firewall policies, we configure SNAT policies for all accepted traffic by the firewall policies. This way, we focus on our firewall policy configuration on what kind of traffic to accept and our SNAT policies on what portion of the accepted traffic to translate and the SNAT mapping to follow. The result is that we simplify our firewall policy configuration by removing the SNAT settings from it. When we configure SNAT policies, we can configure the following matching criteria: incoming interface, outgoing interface, source address, destination address, protocol, source port, accept port mapping. We must also indicate whether we want to perform a SNAT using the outgoing interface address or an IP pool. Note that if we enable central NAT mode, FortiGate doesn't perform a SNAT on traffic unless we configure the corresponding matching central SNAT policy. It's similarly if the traffic doesn't match any of the configured SNAT policies, FortiGate doesn't perform SNAT on the traffic either. Like firewall policies, SNAT policies are processed from top to bottom, and if a match is found, the source address and source port are translated based on the central NAT policy mapping settings. For example, central SNAT example, there is a PC1, personal computer 1, with IP address 10.0.1.10, and this personal computer initiates two connections to the external server. External server IP address is 80.80.80.80. The HTTPS connection matches central SNAT policy ID1, and the source address is translated to the IP pool address 70.70.70.71. The DNS connection, domain name system connection, matches central SNAT policy ID1, which doesn't reference to an IP pool. The result is that the source address of the domain name system connection, DNS connection, is translated to the external interface address 70.70.70.70. So we can see that original packet with source 10.0.1.10, let's say its port was 125, and destination address of the server is 80.80.80.80, and destination port is 443. And central NAT policy is that original address, it's IP address of the computer. Destination address, we put like while that mask 0.0.0.0/0. Destination address, it's by default going to interface when 1, going to address 780.80.80.80. Protocol is 6. NAT is enable. NAT IP pool, there is a name of it, my IP pool. And there is another part that original address is IP address of the computer, destination address is the same, like 0.0.0.0/0, protocol 17, and NAT enable. So from this information, we know that TCP protocol is protocol 6 and UDP protocol is protocol number 17. So there are these policies for TCP and for UDP, and there are firewall policies configured that accept both connections. Now, what if personal computer 1 initiates an ICMP connection to the server? So we know that ICMP connection doesn't have any port numbers. And because there is no matching central SNAT policy, then FortiGate wouldn't perform SNAT for the ICMP connection. ICMP protocol's ID is 1. For protocol 1, there will be no SNAT. What about central DNAT and virtual IPs? What if we enable central NAT? Then we no longer reference VIPs on the firewall policies. Instead, FortiGate automatically creates a rule in the kernel to perform DNAT for the matching traffic based on the configured VIPs. We configure the VIPs on the DNAT and virtual IPs page. So we find this from a graphical user interface, click on Policy and Objects, and then choose DNAT and virtual IPs. Kernel has DNAT rules based on configured VIPs. We are no longer reference VIPs in firewall policies. Firewall policies consist destination addresses must match the VIP mapped addresses. DNAT takes place before firewall policy lookup. Like in the central SNAT case, we must also have a matching firewall policy that accepts the traffic we want to DNAT. However, instead of referencing the VIP, we reference the mapped internal address as destination in the firewall and not the external address. This is because for ingress traffic, DNAT takes place before the firewall policy lookup. That is, FortiGate considers the translated destination address during the firewall policy lookup process. In central NAT mode, VIPs take effect right after we create them. In case we want to exclude a VIP from DNAT, we can disable the object on the FortiGate graphical user interface by using the status button. DNAT and VIP. For example, internet host initiates a connection to 70.70.70.71 on TCP port 443. On FortiGate, the traffic matches the firewall policy ID 1, which references the web server internal address. Web server internal address is 172.16.1.10 as the destination. So there is a DNAT packet consists source. Let's say it's 90.90.90.90 and source port is 2355 and destination port is 443, destination IP address, we put 172.16.1.10. We put internal address, which is behind that firewall, as destination. And protocol ID is 6, protocol is TCP. This is DNAT packet, and original packet source from 90.90.90.90, port 2355, and destination is 70.70.70.71, port 443. Protocol ID is 6 and protocol type is TCP. And what we see here, we can check firewall policy and check VIPs. On FortiGate, the traffic matches the firewall policy ID and we put as destination in DNAT packet 172.16.1.10. Because the VIP is configured as static NAT and has port forwarding disabled, then FortiGate translates the destination address of the packet 172.16.1.10 from 70.70.70.71. Note that we configure the firewall policy to match the VIP virtual IP mapped address as the destination and not the VIP external address. Disabling central NAT. We can disable central NAT on FortiGate command line interface by disabling central-NAT under config system settings. So we put config system settings, set central-NAT, disable, and when disabled, FortiGate stops performing NAT on traffic. Note that when we disable central NAT, it stops performing NAT on traffic because it now requires the network address translation configuration to be applied on the corresponding firewall policies. For FortiGate to perform SNAT, we must enable network address translation on the respective firewall policy and optionally reference the IP pool. For DNAT, we must reference the VIP object as the destination on the corresponding firewall policies. Thank you. See you in the next videos.